So thank you everybody for joining. This is Dr. NAACLS for August 2023. We did skip July. We bumped this topic from July to August. July was pretty swamped with our review committee members and staff because we had our annual summer review committee meeting to go over program recommendations and policy recommendations for the September board meeting. So we are recording this on August 9th, 2023. And we date stamp these just to be sure that if we do discuss specific standard compliance issues and language when it comes to specific compliance in the site visit, for example, which may come up in Q&A, or other items, we like to remind everybody who is watching this at a later date that our compliance issues can change up to twice a year, generally after the September and April board meeting. So if you have a question about if compliance discussions are the most recent, you can obviously check the website for a standard compliance guide, or you can contact staff. Today, while discussing some site visit tips from an insider, our insider is Eric Elsinghorst. Eric is a program director and also a review committee member on RCAP. We also have Michelle Gianosa, who, among many of her responsibilities, is really working with programs, MLS programs specifically for scheduling site visits. And my name is Mark Spence. So we've discussed site visit preparation a few separate times on NAACLS News. So today we're going to try to get into maybe some ideas and concepts we haven't discussed before. There'll be some repetition of basically some standard things that we think it's really, really helpful, but some items that we have discussed in the past may not come up again. So I encourage you to visit either the blog or the NAACLS YouTube page for previous recordings of some site visit tips from other review committee members and site visitors. I just dropped a link in the chat, so you can either copy and paste that now, or I will make sure to include this on the NAACLS news, that link on the NAACLS news post when I make this video available, so you will just have that at a later time. Okay, so housekeeping aside, the first place we're starting with really a tip for making your site visit go a little smoother. I guess before we get started, I would like to emphasize that this is just advice that's coming from kind of an experienced site visitor and things we're seeing from staff. This first section, until we get to Q&A, really isn't going to be a requirement you need to do in order to demonstrate compliance with the standard. These are things that we have seen, that Eric has seen in our experience on staff or his experience being a program director or a site visitor, of things that can make your life a little easier, and also the site visitor's job a little easier, which generally will turn around and make your life a little easier. So I did want to emphasize that this first section really isn't about standard requirements or compliance requirements. It's all about just some helpful assistance that we recommend, but that is not required. So now, disclaimer aside, where we want to start was really some kind of resources that may not be directly obvious to you if this is your first site visit, that we think could pay dividends in the long run. Many times, whether you're at a workshop or a previous Dr. NAACLS, we have advised that you take the site visit review form, which is available on our website, and you use that as a kind of a last second way to check that you have all the materials available to you, available to the reviewers that they need to see. But when we were doing the prep for this, Eric brought up a specific section of the volunteer handbook, which is also emailed to you as we get ready for the site visit, that may be beneficial to not only you, but the stakeholders that are participating in your site visit. So Eric, did you want to go into a little more detail about that?
Yeah, hi Mark, and good morning, Michelle, and everyone online. Yes, the form that has to be completed by your site team has a checklist that we have to complete. It has a series of questions that we have to give a yes or no answer to whether or not we feel that you are satisfying your program is satisfying the standards in these ways, right? And so it is a wonderful reference for you to go to in terms of what documentation, what questions are going to be asked by the site team to ensure that we're compliant with the standards. And so use that as I would suggest that you use that as a guide. I use that as a guide when I've been, our programs have site visited, so that I'm going to ensure that I'm going to know that anticipating exactly what it is the site team is going to be looking for, what types of documents are going to be required for them to be able to happily check that yes box, right? And so that information that's in the site visit form is going to be really useful to inform you in terms of what types of documentation you're going to need. If in your self-study review there were questions, and you responded, if there were any questions or comments or concerns in your site visit, in your self-study review, you had the opportunity to respond to that. But what the site team is going to have to do is ensure that if there was any additional documentation that is going to be needed to be provided during the site visit, in person or virtually to the site visiting team, that you have that documentation available as well too, so that they can check the yes box that concern was addressed, and that there are no concerns remaining relative to whatever was brought up in the self-study review. And so use that as a resource, your site visit review form, because it is what your site team is going to have to be able to be verifying when they're in person on the ground or virtually on your visits, that you got that yes box checked. And so it is often an underutilized resource that it's readily available to you. So I strongly encourage you to use it as a way to ensure that you've got all the necessary documentation.
Additionally, Eric, one thing you mentioned when we had our prep meeting that I hadn't heard somebody share in a workshop or a previous Dr. NAACLS is a section of the volunteer handbook that, a program director may not jump into thoroughly because they may think it's just for the site visitors. But can you go into detail about how maybe utilizing the sample questions could be beneficial to a program director?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mark. At the end of that volunteer handbook, so I encourage you to read the volunteer handbook, first of all, because it's going to give the instructions for your site visitors in terms of, so there's multiple parts of the volunteer handbook, and so there are parts that are specifically relative to the site visit. And so if you're preparing for your site visit, zero in on those sections, because it's going to be giving a wealth of tips about all types of preparations for the site visit. It's what types of interactions are going to happen as soon as your site team is established, what should be happening. And then there's a time frame, even in terms of 2 months out, 2 weeks out, what types of things should be happening to ensure that your site visit goes smoothly. It's a great guide, and I think it's an underutilized guide because it walks you through what to anticipate and when to anticipate it relative to your site visit. And then that includes setting up your schedule for your site visit and who are the important stakeholders with whom the site visit team is going to need to meet. Right. And so if you're a university-based program or a hospital-based programs, who are those key stakeholders? So who are the administrators? Of course, the advisory board, current students, graduates. If you are a university-based program, who are your clinical liaisons? If you're a hospital-based program, do you have supervisors that are involved in education of your students? And so those are all important stakeholders that the site visit team is going to need to meet, because ultimately the role of the site team is to be the eyes and the ears of NAACLS, to verify on the ground what are all the information that's in your self-study report is true and accurate. And so sometimes that things there's the visit, that the actual seeing it, but the important part is meeting many people, because you need to have verification from those other stakeholders that what you say is happening is actually happening. And so we have to interview those stakeholders, right? Have conversations with them, talk to them about what's going on in the program. And so there are many questions that will naturally arise out of the content of what's in your self-study and your self-study review. But regardless of what that content may suggest, there's a standard set of questions that is recommended by NAACLS. Those questions are in the volunteer handbook, right? And so if you go to the back of the volunteer handbook, there's a set of questions for university-based programs. There's a set of questions for hospital-based programs that are there as suggestions for the site team as to what types of information we might need to try to glean out of those stakeholders. When I'm in the shoes of the program director who's having a site team, I provide those questions, right? I will go to my administrators, to my dean, to my executive vice chancellor when they're going to be meeting with the site team, and I'm going to say, I prep them. I make sure that they are prepped. I give them the whole story about the accreditation cycle that's happened in NAACLS and where we started and how we got to where we are, and say, these are the people that are going to be coming. And I let them know, I give them a bio about the people that are coming, about the membership of the site committee and where they're coming from and what their responsibilities are, so that they know exactly who they're going to be meeting with. And then I give them a copy of the questions that NAACLS provides to site visitors. And I go through the answers to those questions with those stakeholders, right? Because they, to make sure that they know that, that what to anticipate and what types of, and what's an appropriate way to respond, right? And I do that with all of our stakeholder groups, right? And so whether it's our administrators, whether it's our advisory board, the clinical liaisons, trying to get, graduates and together enough to be able to, often what you have to do is by email or it's like, here's the questions, here's the site visitors, here's the team, here's the questions they're likely to ask you, right? And so, but getting that information out to your stakeholders in advance is just going to help facilitate the whole process. And so I strongly encourage you to utilize that resource of the volunteer handbook. Another what I feel is an underutilized resource is the compliance guide. Right. And so we have a compliance guide. NAACLS has a compliance guide, and hopefully you utilized your compliance guide when you were filling out your self-study, because it identifies for those elements of the self-study what you should be including to document your compliance with standards. But for every one of those standards, it not only does it say this is what you should be putting in your self-study, but this is what you should be making sure you have available for the site team. Right. And so make sure you're going through the compliance guide and look at those bullet points and read those sections that are relative to what documentation you should have for the self-study, right? For the site visit team, excuse me, because that is going to be what a site visitor is also going to be looking for, because we're using the compliance guide as well as the site visitor. We are going to be not only using our site visit review form to make sure we're checking all the various boxes that are documenting that your compliance with standards, but the compliance guide is also our guide in terms of to ensure that we are asking for all the correct documentation. And so do that in advance. Make sure that you've gone through the compliance guide. Look for those issues that are those items that are associated with the site visit, and make sure you've gathered that information in advance. So you've got now 3 things to be thinking about as really good guides. You have the site visit review form, you have the volunteer manual, and you have the compliance guide that gives you lots of information about the types of things that you're going to need to have at the ready for when your site team shows up.
So we had one question. Most of the questions we'll handle at the end, but this question I think is important just to avoid any confusion. So I'm not sure where it started, but when we say volunteer handbook, we do mean the volunteer manual. I'm not sure where it started internally. We also started calling it the volunteer handbook. So I apologize if there was any confusion, but the volunteer manual, which is available online and which is emailed to the site visit team, including program directors, is also what we've been referring to as the volunteer handbook. So it's the same document. I apologize for any confusion that may have created. So Eric, you kind of touched on this just now, but it's really important that program directors not only make sure that the materials are ready for the site visitors, but also some additional steps like redactions and things like that nature, things of that nature. So can you go into a little more detail of not only we've kind of addressed where to find what materials are needed, but maybe suggestions about how to organize those materials so it's ready for the site visitors.
Yeah, and so for our in the first bullet point there, provided the materials provide in the self-study review response available. So I strongly encourage you to reread your self-study and your self-study review response, because myself as a program director, I know there are things that when I'm in writing those documents, I may make the comment, because you don't need to provide all the data or all the information or all the details into the self-study or the response. But you're going to may make the comment that full documentation will be available to the site team during the visit. Make sure it's there, right? Because make sure you gather that information, right? And I gather it and I organize it by standard, so that I know I can provide that information either through and to work with your site team for their preferred method of delivery of that information. Some of that information may need to be done prior to the visit, and using the box as a mechanism to provide that documentation is the easiest thing to do. But perhaps your site team, when they're here, there's documents that they're going to want available to them, and generally electronic databases are fine. And that may be just as simple as making it available on a flash drive for documentation that's going to be that you're providing actually on site, as opposed to prior to the meeting. And so that second bullet point are the items identified in the standard compliance guide, organized and ready, and we touched on that already. But again, I'm going to organize that information by standard so that I have all that information available. Redactions complete. So that, for example, one of the things that we have to review and look at is student records, to ensure that the information that is in the self-study that says you're retaining information relative to student records, we have to verify that that's happening. And so that would be that. So for example, I typically will ask a program director to give me 3 student records. And so those records would be for a current student, a graduate, and then a student that encountered some type of difficulty along the way. For example, maybe there was an academic probation, or there was a remediation process. We're verifying that the student is being properly protected and informed in accordance to what your program's policies and procedures are, so that we're matching with those standard 4 that's the standard 4 requirements associated with students. And so I will ask for just an example of 3 different student files. So now that has to be redacted, right? So you're going to have to take out student names from those files. If we're verifying, for example, for standard 2, we're looking at outcomes and we're verifying pass rates. You're going to have that information from the ASCP, but redact out student names so that your students remain protected. And so that may be all available though, still in electronic form. Sometimes for you, it may be easier to provide hard copies, and that certainly would be something that would be happening on in person during the review. But you want to make sure you are protecting your students by having all that information redacted. The next bullet point are the site visitors have the passwords they need. And so, for example, maybe if you're using whatever your educational platform is, if there's the opportunity to be able to get a guest password in order to access course information, that is one type of the password. Other types of passwords would just be access for Wi-Fi and connecting to your local Wi-Fi, so that we have that type of connection. And the last bullet point are the items in the box cloud folder that NAACLS staff provided there, that whatever it is that's going to be required here, and ensure that those types of things are going to be available to the team. If not in the box, then in some other type of form, whether it's electronic, flash drive, or hard copy. And so those are some of the things that you want to be making sure you've got ahead of time. And of course, you'll be working with your site team, with your site team, because they're going to help identify for you what it is that they're necessarily going to want to see. You've got a lot of tools in your tool belt in terms of what I should anticipate I'm going to need, and make sure those documents are ready. But if there's anything in particular that your site team wants, for example, when I say I want, my example of 3 student records, right? And so then that I know what I need to provide, because otherwise it's like, well, what do I need to do to document your compliance? And so work with your site team and make sure you ask any questions about if you have uncertainties about what it is they're going to be looking for. Use them as a resource as well.
Okay, so we know that there are a lot, as we've spoken about multiple times, there's a lot of external parties or stakeholders that are involved in a site visit. And sometimes making sure that all of these separate groups that may be on campus and even off campus are aware of what's happening can be a challenge. So Eric, do you have any advice, just ways that program directors can make sure that all of these separate groups are in the fold of what's happening and when it's happening?
Yeah, it's all communication. And so of course you're going to be communicating with those people as soon as you've got your, well, it's actually even before you've got your schedule set up. So for, when I've got, once as program director, once I know what dates are set, you've given NAACLS staff your set of dates, right? And even to give you a set of dates, you had to have preliminary conversations with administrators, with advisory board members, with clinical liaisons, saying, I've got my site visit coming up and here's some dates. Would you check your calendar and check for availability, right? So that the dates that you're suggesting to to NAACLS as potential site visit dates align with those important stakeholders, right? And so then you get your confirmation from NAACLS, right? Here's your date and here's your potential site visitors, and you give your okay on that. And then as soon as that's done, you already have to have in mind what my schedule is going to look like, right? Even before you really should have set this up in advance in your mind, even before you may have your site team set, is what my schedule is going to look like. And again, go back to the volunteer manual, because in that volunteer manual, there is an example schedule for university-based visits, for hospital-based visits. And so even though you haven't communicated yet, even maybe your site team hasn't been established or you haven't communicated with them yet, you've got an idea of what that schedule is going to look like. So you could have, as soon as you got your team approved, get in touch with those key stakeholders, with your administrators, with the advisory board members, with the clinical liaisons, and say, okay, we got the date set. please hold this date. And here's a preliminary time to please put on your calendar and send them an invitation, right? So that they, it gets on their calendar, right? Just as they hold the date. You then can establish with working, one of the first things you want to be able to do with your, once your site team is established, is set up the preliminary draft schedule, so that you've got, you know that you're in a certain, what time frames you are going to have your stakeholders meeting with the site team. And so then you can confirm those dates with those stakeholders, right, at an early date, so it's on their calendar. Right. So the other thing that you want to do is establish with those stakeholders, is this going to be an in-person, or are you going to be remoting in to the meeting with the team? Because if your team is in person, it's perfectly known and accepted that some of those individuals might need to remote in, right? And so particularly, advisory board members, clinical liaisons, they could be quite distant, and then maybe they're not coming into town to meet with the site team, but the site team still wants to meet with them. And so make sure that that those people that are going to be meeting with the site team, they know whether or not they're going to be there in person, or they're going to be doing it remoting it, right? And so once the schedule really does get finalized, because initially it's a draft schedule you're working out with your site team, then once that's finalized, another confirmation out to the stakeholders. Okay, we've got date set, right, and time set. So this is going to be the time. Now we're talking maybe a month and a half in advance, right? And so as we're getting closer, I just automatically ping out those people. Okay, we got 2 weeks. Here's our site team's on the way. We'll be here soon. We're looking forward to having you meet with them. And that's when I will provide them. I will provide them that information. Like, here's the questions they're going to ask, right? So that you're touching base, getting them prepped, and then just before the site visit team arrives, do another confirmation, right? So that you're getting feedback from them that, okay, yep, it's on my calendar. I'll be there either in person or remotely. And depending on the stakeholder and my level of confidence in terms of whether or not they're going to show up, I might do another confirmation. And to me, the group of stakeholders that to me is the most difficult cat to herd in terms of meeting with the site team is graduates, because they're working, and it's like they're busy with their lives. And yeah, it's like, yep, I'm definitely going to be there. I'll meet with the site team. And then even if you're giving them a reminder, they're going to forget, right? And so depending on your relationship with your graduates, what I do is have their mobile numbers, and the day of. It's like the graduate meeting is set up. I set up my graduate meeting for site visitors as one of the last things of the day on the first day, because that'll be a 4 to 5 o'clock meeting, because that is when they're getting off shift. The daytimers are coming off shift. They're done at 3 o'clock, right? And so I want them to be meeting with the site visitors at 4. So okay, they're maybe it's like I'm at the University of Kansas, where we're very close to the hospital. The hospital is I just walk over to the hospital, and I can see my graduates all the time. But I know that they're on campus, but they're still going to forget, right? And so I'm going to text them that morning. Site visitors are here. Looking forward to seeing you this afternoon, right? Because they're the hardest cat to herd to me, are the graduates. And you do want to make sure that the site team is meeting with graduates. I mean, that's a representative group. I mean, I'd like to have at least 5 or 6 graduates in my meeting with graduates, so that I know I'm getting I'm getting representation of a couple of years worth of graduates, right? And so it is communication, a lot of work. But if you want things to go as smoothly as possible, then it's worth all that effort. So there is on the slide here, the softening is requiring multiple check-ins and extra effort ahead of time, but it's going to pay off because it makes everything go a whole lot more smoothly. The other thing is that if you're in these meetings with the site visitors are happening without you there as a program director. And so you might occasionally need just to keep that on track as well. You're going to end up being the timekeeper, right? And so if you got a schedule and you got groups of people that are going to be waiting to meet with your site visitors, you're going to need to be able to check into that meeting without getting into that meeting. Because if they have to, okay, you got 5 minutes to wrap up. Well, who are you going to send that to? Well, send it to your site visitors, right? And so if you've got your cell phone number available and you've got their numbers available, you're going to be wanting to stay in touch with that site team. And so they're in a meeting with administrators. And I don't know about yours, but my dean can talk a lot. Yeah, a whole lot. And so, but I know that there's somebody at the end of that half hour that site team is going to go else to meet with. And so I have to be pinging him. I have to ping the dean, say, okay, you got 5 minutes left, right? And I may ping him, but I'll also to the site visitors, just keep you on track. We got 5 minutes left, and we're going to move on, so that they know, right? Because you got to wrangle the cats, right? And so so those are some of the things you might want to be thinking about in terms of ensuring that things go smoothly during the visit.
Okay, let's move on to the actual physical space that site visitors will be utilizing a lot to have conversations, confidential conversations, but also perhaps to have some of the virtual interviews and things of that nature. So Eric, do you want to go into some details about things you appreciate with the workroom that's set up by the program for you to kind of execute some of these items from the site visit?
Sure. As Mark mentioned, is you do want to have your site visitors have a private space. This should not be at a conference table in your office, or you're going to want to make sure that they have a private space, and that it's large enough to be able to accommodate some of these meetings, because that may be where you want them to meet with graduates or members of the advisory board or any of the other stakeholders, and have those people come to the site visitors rather than the site visitors going to them, right? Because if you have graduates and current students, well, with graduates, they're going to need someplace to go. Maybe current students, the site visitors may go to a student laboratory, because that's where the current students are gathered to meet with the site visitors, and that's perfectly fine. But often you're going to have that situation where you're going to have somebody that is coming to campus, and in order to meet with the site visitors, and so you're going to need a physical space for everyone to be in. So something that's going to be large enough to accommodate those meetings, and so that and it should be actually a secure space as well, because there's going to be various documents. The site visitors are going to have their materials. And so let's say it's the time where we're going to go on the physical tour of the space, because we have to, if you're on an in-person visit, you're going to go on an in-person tour of the space. If you're a virtual visitor, you're going to go on a virtual tour of the space, but you're at the tour of the space. And if you're going to be there and you're there in person and you're leaving, that room needs to be able to be secured, where your site team has the key, or whatever it is, a code on a combination lock or something, so that that space is secure. And if you're going to have virtual components to those meetings, then it also has to be able to provide that so that there's good Wi-Fi signal in that space, so that your site team is going to be able to, number one, access the internet to get any type of documentation that's necessary. But also, if you're going to have any video conferencing component to people that are going to be participating in a meeting, that you're going to have a good, strong signal for that to be able to happen. So that now, if you are going to have those types of if you're going to have a remote participants, it's always great if you may or may not have this, but if you have something like a teleconference room that's set up that already has a room camera, then and for example, like a wall mounted television, that's super awesome, because then everyone can see everyone else. You may not have all that, right? And so, but as long as you even got a room that's got a good Wi-Fi signal, your site team can set up a Zoom, and you can conduct it those meetings right off their laptops. They just need a good signal, right? And so you're going to want to make sure that if you have virtual component to any of those meetings that are happening in that space, then that they're going to be able to have those types of good uninterrupted signal. The security of that room, then also, if you're providing hard copy of documents of documents that are going to be needed by the site team, you're going to want to make sure that room is secure too, because you don't want those documents just going to be open and available. And so and one of the last sentence there, a few refreshments are also always appreciated. Bottles of water are awesome, right? And so you're talking with a lot of people, and you get dehydrated, particularly indoor air conditioning, if it's a or heating systems or whatever, tend to dry out the air, and so you're talking with a lot of people. So some bottles of water are always greatly appreciated. And also, when you're working out your schedule, the opportunity for occasional breaks, so that you can take care of important functions, are also going to be really valued as well.
And finally, you can prepare like crazy. You can take all this advice we've given. You can fulfill every step that Eric has suggested, and something's going to go wrong the day of. So this is just a reminder, just to relax. I mean, NAACLS tries hard to have a very collegial and uplifting site visit experience. We try to avoid, if possible, for it to be a very grueling process. So, and it's also, I understand that NAACLS can kind of be this like faceless entity that occasionally wants paperwork from you and probably bothers you from your day-to-day job. But our volunteers and the people coming up with these requirements, the people doing this, the visitors, they're also educators, and they are program directors, so they understand. So we will work with you if there's any unexpected bumps out of your control along the way. Eric, did you have anything to kind of add to this slide?
Nope, not really. As Mark pointed out, we know what you're dealing with, and so because we've been there ourselves, and so we're happy to work along on those problems. One thing that you look at like that volunteer manual, it's going to say something about a printer and having a printer available. Well, having a printer capacity is going to be a good thing too. But often what I will do is if there's something that needs to be printed, I can email that to the program director, and they can print something out and bring it into the secure room. And so in terms of mistakes happen, bumps along the way, it's like maybe we're gonna have to print something out, we're gonna have to generate some documents. And that was just so, in terms of one of those things that might be necessary in terms of dealing with bumps, is that the capacity for printing. But yep, the point is to work where your colleagues as site visitors, we're your peers, and it is a process that helps us as in the laboratory community, in both directions. And so we're there to be helping you.
Okay, we're going to move on to Q&A. If you have any questions, you have two options. First, you'll see kind of a Q&A chat box separate from the actual meeting chat. It's a little box in the toolbar. You can enter a question in there, or you can raise your hand and we can do it over audio. Before we get into the actual, and this Q&A can be about anything related to NAACLS standards and process. It doesn't specifically need to be about the site visit. So if if you're working on an application packet, or if you have a question about a self-study you're looking for this spring, or putting the final touches on a self-study that's due in October, that's fair game too. But speaking of questions, wanted to point you to a resource that's always available, and these are our DLPs, which stands for Discipline Lead Persons. So the names you see on this screen are members of a NAACLS review committee. They're representing a discipline on that review committee, and they are available to help with standard interpretation questions. So if you have some more of a process-driven question, that should come to staff. And if you don't know where your question goes to, you can always start with staff, and we'll be happy to direct you to some more of standard interpretation. One small thing though, I mean, these are volunteers. They're graciously giving their time. So we want to keep this focused on more standard interpretation, but they're not necessarily available to, give a once over for a site visit, confirm items for a self-study, things of that nature. Having to do a pre-review of a progress report can be overly burdensome. And also, since they are members of the review committee that will be forming a recommendation to the board of directors, we want to avoid putting them in any conflict of interest type of situation. So, but they are volunteers that are gracious and very willing to help. On that note, we have many volunteers on the call right now. One of our very experienced site visitors, Terry, want to make sure that we mentioned the breaks item too. So Eric, I'm glad you mentioned to make sure that there's breaks programmed in the schedule. So thank you for that, Terry, and thank you for the rest of the volunteers that are on the call. We have a few questions right now for the last 15 minutes or so. So first question from Meredith. In regard to faculty, are adjunct instructors required to be present for the site visit?
I'm not sure whether or not you wanted me to address that. Or
Yeah. If you have the answer to that, Eric. Sorry.
Yeah, okay. Well, generally, I mean, I'm not expecting I'm going to meet with every faculty member, right? And so, because they may be teaching, things are, when that team is happening, I'm not anticipating I'm meeting with everyone. If an adjunct is available, then that's great. If that may more likely, because they're adjunct, more likely be able to join remotely, zooming in the meeting with faculty members. That's fantastic. So that you could have basically a hybrid meeting going on between adjuncts and in person. So do they have to be there? No, they don't have to be there. You want to try to get as many of if you've got like one or two primary faculty and the majority are adjuncts, then you want to make sure that you've got a good representation of those adjuncts. Not that you need every one of them, but you want a good representation of the adjuncts that are participating in your program.
Next, is there a suggested percentage of recent graduates for a site visit for how many years representation? Would there be a different number percentage for a new program?
I mentioned I like to see at least five or six, and if the more you can get, the better. There isn't any set number that have to be there, but I like to make sure that I've got if it's a new program and you only have a couple of years of graduates and you've got 3 graduates in each class, you may not be able to get all 6. Right. And so you try to get as many as you possibly can. But I find that having a conversation with 1 or 2 graduates doesn't give me confidence that I'm getting a good representation of what's happening from their perspective. And so I think I'm not sure if Mark or Michelle, you've got any better guidance than that?
No, I think that's something, obviously, as Eric kind of said, and important to reiterate, we don't have a specific requirement. Different site visitors may have different preferences based on your specific program. So I would just let that be part of the conversation with your actual specific site visitor. So there's going to be a lot of planning and a lot of communication as you lead up to the site visit. I would just encourage you to ask those questions directly to those people. The next two questions are kind of similar. When using multiple facilities / locations for clinical experiences, can video tours be created / provided in advance?
Well, there's not a requirement that your site team goes to your clinical liaisons any longer. That used to be a requirement, but it is not required that you go to, say, your university-based program and you have clinical affiliates scattered all over the place, right? Maybe some of them are local, some of them are distant. In the way back, we had to go on those physical tours of affiliates, right? At least a representation of them if they were local. And that is no longer a requirement. And so a physical tour of the space is your space. And for whether it's a university or hospital-based program. And so you don't have to provide that tour of affiliates, right? If you want to provide that, then you could provide a time to for those types of remote, but your schedule is actually pretty tight. It's really busy, and that's, I think, part of why those visits dropped off, because often it's a physical distance that is insurmountable in terms of the amount of time that's available for a site visit. And so there's no longer that requirement that we visit your affiliates. Anything,
So
Mark?
I don't have anything. No, I'm sorry. Michelle, did you have anything with that?
No.
Okay. How do you handle logistics of evaluating physical facilities that may be split between multiple cities?
So if physical facilities in terms of a clinical experience, so if we're talking about a clinical learning experience, that's what we were just talking about.
Yeah.
And so if you're talking about, for example, your students are in a part of their didactic training prior to going to clinicals, as they're going to be splitting that between different cities. I would, and seeing those, for example, let's say this is a university-based program and they've got different locations. You're going to need to be able to have a virtual component to those spaces, because if we're going to have to verify that they have adequate laboratory space in order to do their didactic component prior to going to clinicals, then you're going to need a virtual component for that. But what we're talking about there is, that what's at multiple different cities is the applied learning experience, then you don't need to provide that tour. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, I think so. And if the more finer details, again, I would just recommend, discussing that with your actual site visitors and how they want to see it, to kind of add a little more context to this kind of general advice. That's all the questions we have now. We're almost at our hour, so keep it open a little bit, but otherwise we will be shutting it down. Yeah, that looks like it's it. Thank you everybody for joining. Eric.